Hi, I'm Ron Milton. I went to HB Beale and I'm a Londoner. I spent most of my life in London. There was a four-year period where I was on the East Coast. When I went to university. The work that I'm working on for this particular show is based on my life from being a child to this present day. For example, I've been doing the show's basically about birds in flight, and with the birds, I used to watch the migration when I was a kid, and now that I'm an adult and retired from teaching, I have time to watch birds again in the fall. So that's part of it. The fact that there are airplanes in it also goes back to my youth and looking at airplanes. And I remember the very first air show in London in 1967 and being fascinated by the biplanes. I tend to spend a fair amount of time at zoos or also museums, so I look at the birds there. And recently I've made friends with somebody who's an archaeologist who works with animal bones, so I've been able to get a hold of different kinds of skulls because he needs to know what the animals are when he goes to an indigenous person site to figure out what the people ate at that particular village. So these are all parts of what I'm dealing with. Now, I live in London, Ontario, which is in the flight path of a lot of species in the fall. And as I said, as a child, I used to watch them fly over. But the other thing that happens in the fall in the area there are a lot of small fairs, such as the Western Fair and the Ilderton Fair. And most small communities have these fall exhibitions. So part of the show is about that as well. I like my work to have a serious side, but also at the same time have a sense of humor about things too. So when you see some of the pieces, like the one that's behind me, it's based on a bagatella, which is a form of pinball machine, which I would have seen more as a child, or my dad would have dealt with as a child. And there is one later on in the show, which is a small 1960s plastic one, which I would have had something like that when I was a kid, given to me at Christmas time, which would have been put in a stocking. So I try to combine all sorts of different aspects. The show is a combination of a whole bunch of different mediums. There's acrylic paintings, mostly done because I like the shininess for doing the bagatellas, because I wanted them to look like old pinball machines. Whereas the oil paintings I like doing because I can get more manipulation with the paint as far as blurring it together. And then there's also the watercolors, which I also do quite a bit of. So that's the painting aspect, but I'm also a printmaker and was known as a printmaker for 30 years at HB Beale, and now I've started developing a program at the Woodstock Art Gallery. And I'm also a sculptor as well as a draftsman. So I don't try and confine myself to one particular medium. I try to push and shove it, and sometimes even mix them together to come up with something new. I also am a person who basically likes working with antiques, and I've been a collector since the age of 14. So I will sometimes take objects that I find in thrift stores or antique stores and combine them back into the piece. And there's a cigar box in the show which I've painted a painting of a mouse on top of, because the cigar box is for white owl cigars, and therefore a prey of that particular bird. So I've tried to look in this particular show at birds from different views and flight, because I've always been inspired by flight. Now, as a child, my grandfather was a veteran of World War I and got to watch the evolution of flight during World War I, from soldiers going up first in observation balloons and then later on getting into biplanes, and then biplanes turning into bombers and different kinds of fighter pilots. And that sort of stuff interests me as well. So there's a bit of family history as well. Even though he wasn't a pilot, one of his brothers was in the Air Force. And again, my grandfather grew up in England in the late 1800s to early 1900s. So he actually watched things like the very first airplanes, like the Wright brothers, sort of taking off the ground and then falling back to Earth. So this was a man who watched that sort of thing happen, and then eventually in his life got to watch the very first man land on the moon in '69. And I was with him when it actually happened, so watching the TV. So all these things, all these relationships come together when I'm working on a show. I look at it from as many different viewpoints as I can, and there's usually a major story that is dealt with in all cases, and usually the story that goes behind it dictates the medium. So in some cases the medium will be really tie into what I want to say the best at that particular point. For example, with the silver point drawings, which you'll see in a few minutes, I dealt with the skeleton in that because it's a very fragile looking medium, and those are very fragile looking things. So I tend to draw very dark when I work with certain mediums. So working with silver point dictates the fact that I can't get it extremely contrasty or extremely, I can't press really hard or get, so the medium basically dictates what's going to happen.